Good morning everyone, I'm Tanya Brass, and on behalf of Resibuild we would like to introduce to you the first stop of our Resibuild Roadshow, which is here in Reading. We're glad to welcome all of you and have taken the time to join us here today in person, and for many of you who are joining from the live stream. Just to let you know that we have some fire exits if you'd just like to come out of here and take a right to the front door, or you can go through the left-hand side as well. And if we can ask you as well to keep your phones off, that would be brilliant. So, Sapphire here in Reading is our first destination, and we're looking forward to bringing new insights to each destination of the trip. The next steps on our first stage of our roadshow are Dublin, Belfast, Manchester and Leicester. Once we've completed our first stage, our North American team will kick off in Canada. The roadshow will then start its second stage, where it will work east, starting initially in Vancouver, then on to Edmonton. We'll then be following on with Calgary, Winnipeg, Ottawa, and finally Montreal. But the last stop will be at Sapphire's Toronto showroom, where there is an exciting showdown for us between traditional balcony methods and Sapphire's remote locker install method. While the roadshow is en route, it will be covering a variety of different topics. That's why we are live streaming the following locations: Reading, which has a focus on sustainability; Belfast, which is a live stream fire test; Manchester, which is focusing on the external envelope; Leicester, which is covering on MMC, competency and carbon reduction. So if you'd like to sign up in person or live stream, you can do this via www.resi.build. Resibuild is a brand owned by the ATW Group, which is the largest of Sapphire balconies. They also own Resibuild as well as Sapphire. Our group's mantra is innovation to prosper the community, and which is what leads our drive to connect industry experts and thought leaders within those in the residential sector. We hope by facilitating these critical conversations, we can help lead the construction community to a higher level. I'd love to welcome now our first speaker, who's Andrew Sadler, and he will be speaking to us on carbon today. So Andrew, if you'd like to come up and we can take it from there. Thank you very much.
Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm Andrew from a company called Belfast. We are energy and sustainability consultants, obviously focusing on energy performance in the main, SAP calculations and energy performance certificates, which we have here in the UK, but we also do Passive House, which is an international standard on low carbon or zero carbon homes, and we also do BREEAM assessments as well, which is a sustainability assessment methodology which is sort of used throughout the world, both on sort of new construction and existing properties as well. So the talk today is really looking at how we achieve low energy, zero carbon buildings. It does have a focus on kind of UK building regulations, but it's equally applicable to the rest of the world as well, trying to achieve net zero targets. So, what does net zero mean in the construction industry? It's basically trying to build properties that produce or use less energy than they generate, whether that's on a sort of individual building, or whether it's on a site-wide development, or indeed at a sort of national scale as well. So what we're trying to do is we're starting to build really low energy buildings, and we start in the UK. Particularly in London, we've got this sort of hierarchy of 3 steps the Be Lean, Be Clean and Be Green, which the people in the UK are probably well aware of, particularly those in London. It's kind of the London mayor's hierarchy of kind of reducing our carbon emissions or our energies from our buildings. So we start with the fabric first. So we try and get our energy demands of our buildings as low as possible. And that's through good fabric energy efficiencies. So good low U values on the buildings, on the walls, on the roofs, anything sort of the external envelope, good quality windows, both in terms of heat loss and sort of heat gains in the summer. So we are really looking at trying to improve the building to reduce its carbon impact. District heating, again, quite bespoke really to London from a community energy point of view. Obviously London's quite a populated area where it's possible to have lots of community energy schemes because a lot of the buildings are in close proximity, and you can use sort of excess heat from commercial buildings and perhaps pump that into the domestic buildings. Slightly more difficult to do on other buildings, more rural buildings, just because of the distance of all of the buildings. So we often, we struggle with that one outside of London or sort of highly populated areas. And then the third one, whilst it says on-site energy, I mean, that's what we're looking again in terms of building regulations in this country, looking at what we can do on site to produce energy through whether that's sort of micro wind, micro turbines, solar energy is massive at the moment, particularly with the cost of electricity and the kind of fuel crisis that I think the majority of countries are experiencing at the moment. So we've got these kind of three stages. The first one, really getting those energy demands down. Once we've done that, how can we generate the energy efficiently? Again, sorry, this is a bit UK centric, but in terms of the UK building regulations, we're looking at operational energy and operational carbon. So we're looking at things that are sort of independent of how you live in the house. So it doesn't really matter how many iPads and computers you have running for the building regulations. It's quite difficult to kind of regulate how many iPads people have at the moment. I'm sure that will come eventually. So we're looking at space heating, hot water, lighting, pumps and fans. So pumps for the heating, pumps and fans for the ventilation, because we can specifically control those through regulations. There are things that we can do outside of that the building regulations does take into account slightly, which is the cooking and small appliances, but it's a bit broad brush. It's a bit, an average household rather than people's specific households. We have started again in the UK, led by London, again, looking at embodied carbon and how embodied carbon can be brought into the sort of building regulation format, which we'll go on to a bit during the presentation. But in the main, we're looking at those regulated emissions. And it says energy up there, but I mean, energy translates to carbon, so we're trying to reduce our energy, and the byproduct of that is we're reducing our carbon impact as well. So what are the challenges of getting there? And there are a lot of challenges to get to zero carbon. It's easy to get to, 30% carbon, perhaps even 50% carbon reductions, but trying to go to that next level of sort of that zero carbon is extremely challenging. There's a lot of talk in government about, we've seen just stop oil, and we've seen lots of protests and things like that. The government are trying to do things, the UK government are trying to do things to reduce that. Whether they're doing it at the speed that we need, that's open to debate. But, we really need to regulate this to get people to kind of get to that zero carbon. There was some thought that, you regulated so far and then let the developers do the rest, because that's what the public want. But ultimately, without that red tape, it's very, very difficult to get people to move as quick as we need to get there. There's a big thing in the construction industry on the performance gap. It's, when we do these assessments for people, it's very based on numbers and facts and figures that we're using to do calculations, but is that getting translated on site? So are people building the way that we've modelled the building? Are people living in those buildings as we thought they were going to live? Those sort of things. So there's a big thing in building regulations that is trying to narrow down the performance gap, and going back to sort of our experience in Passive House. Passive House is sort of seen at the pinnacle of trying to reduce that performance gap, and seeing what we've designed in the calculation in the spreadsheet is actually what's happening in real terms. And that leads on to quality control, making sure that those buildings are being built as the design dictates. There is developer reluctance. There is a cost associated with trying to get to net zero, without pulling out any developers, they do have shareholders that they need to answer to, and that does come down to a bit of profit from the construction. So we need to get over that. And infrastructure, have we got the infrastructure in the sort of pipeline that's going to produce that? And again, in the UK, the government is very fixated on electrifying our heating network, and rightly so. I mean, if we've got an electric heating network, then we can use solar panels or wind or wave power to generate that. But we've got a lot of electric vehicles. We need a lot of electric charging. We've got a lot of heat pumps. How are we going to get that power to the houses or the buildings? The infrastructure isn't there yet, for sure. And again, occupant understanding. There's always that thing about the property being in the right place at the right price. I think that's still a big thing. People don't necessarily look at the EPC rating and think, I'm going to buy that house because it's super low carbon. Is it close to a school? Is it close to my family? Those sort of things still play a big role. So I think we're seeing a change in that, with the increase in running costs, where people are actually now getting hit by the pocket. So they're looking at the EPC and going, well, this house is very cost effective to run. And by that very nature, it will be generally a low carbon home. There is the sort of energy supply side of it. Again, as I said, the UK government is trying to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and trying to electrify the network. There is talk about that the mains gas being switched off. It's getting less talked about now as that date comes closer. I'm yet to be convinced that that'll actually happen. But there is still that on the pipeline, that they're going to switch off gas and try and go over to electric. And again, talking about perhaps hydrogen as a way forward as well. Again, I've got my own opinions on that, but that's for another presentation. There's some carbon factors from our grid, and we've recently seen the electricity carbon factor. This is the latest building regulations that came out at the back end of last year. The carbon factor for electricity has dropped significantly on the basis that our energy system is becoming less and less reliant on carbon intense generation. We've got a lot of solar and we've got a lot of wind that we're utilising. So actually now it's quite favourable compared to mains gas, which was the go-to fuel prior to the building regulation update. Just go over some of the renewable technologies that are open to us. We've got solar, very popular in this country, can be ground-mounted, roof-mounted. Is very good at producing energy, and is a big part of the strategy in terms of trying to move away from a high carbon infrastructure. So we can have them roof mounted on big industrial estates, we can have them ground mounted in farms. Again, there's a conversation to have around that, but we can also have them locally on roof mounted on houses as well. Heat pumps, again, you're seeing a lot of heat pumps, particularly in our country. Ground source, air source, extremely efficient way of using electricity to produce heat, space heating and hot water. And particularly, if we're going to electrify the heat network, we can either use pure electric, which can be quite costly, or we can use something like a heat pump, which sort of 200, even 400% there for a ground source heat pump. So we're using that energy very, very efficiently, so that we don't start to see scary electric bills, but we also do our bit for the carbon. Hydrogen boilers I won't go into too much, but there is trials going on about hydrogen, using hydrogen, and we've got a whole hydro street set up to see whether hydrogen can be used going forward. I think that's a bit of a way off for it to be mass adopted, but there is that sort of research going on in the background. There are two types of hydrogen production. One more green than the other. You've got the blue, so you need to be aware of this when you're looking at hydrogen as the solution, if that is the solution. But the blue carbon is still producing carbon, but that's being stored by carbon capture. The green isn't producing carbon as part of the process. You've got the kind of hydrogen, water and oxygen as the byproducts. This one here with the blue carbon, you've got the CO2 coming out the end and having to be stored in some way. Building fabric. This is really sort of looking at the embodied carbon. So what are we using to build the buildings in the first place? So there was the operational energy producing carbon. That's one thing, but we need to think about how we are producing the houses or the buildings in the first place. How much carbon is going in to kind of produce those? It's kind of considered a hidden energy use because people haven't really thought about it. But as I said, in the UK, it's starting to now see embodied carbon as part of the planning process, which is great to see. So when we're looking at the embodied carbon, we're looking at the whole life of the building. So we're looking at what was the carbon cost to produce the raw material, what was the carbon cost to transport it to the construction site, the upfront carbon there. And then we've got our in-use, which we've pretty much sort of covered in our operational carbon. So what is the carbon associated with using that? We've also started to look at end of life. What happens when we need to maintain those, and what happens when, at the end of the life cycle, can that be recycled? Can it be reused? Or are we just wasting it? So it's a lot more sort of, as it says, a lot more whole life rather than kind of individual parts. How much is that whole system going to cost us in terms of carbon over the life stage of the building? And you can see some of the impacts of various carbon materials. Aluminium, steel, right at the high end there. Timbers, earth at the low end. Are we using the right material for the right project? It's not to say that steel's a bad material to use, but just being aware of the carbon impact of concrete or steel or timber, and what's best to build the building with. So just going over some of those. So timber, carbon sequestering. So when it's out in the environment, it's collecting all that carbon. When we chop those trees down, we use that for development. That carbon is then locked into that building for the entirety of that building's life. Whatever happens to it afterwards, we need to think about, because it could be reused. If it's burnt, then we're releasing the carbon again. But whilst it's in that building, it's locked in. And as long as it's done through managed forestry, when we're taking the old trees that are sort of taking in less carbon, locking that into a building, and we're planting new trees that are absorbing carbon. So, well-managed forestry is a really important part of that. It's lightweight. You can get high levels of insulation, but there is obviously fire risk concerns that we need to think about, but it's a great product in terms of embodied carbon. Concrete, it does have a relatively high carbon impact or embodied carbon impact, but it is, it is locally sourced, or it can be locally sourced, certainly in the UK. It has good structural properties, and it has some good thermal mass properties, so it's good for heating and cooling. which can again reduce the operational carbon. And the Concrete Association in the UK, the group of suppliers are doing their bit to reduce how high that impact of carbon is. A lot of that is in the cement, so if you can reduce with your engineer, you can reduce the amount of cement in the mix, then you're reducing the carbon. So there's lots of things that they've done as an industry to reduce that carbon. Steel frames, as I said, again, high embodied carbon, but actually it has got good structural strength to it, good for long spans, which you would struggle with timber, quick and easy to construct, and long lasting. And again, if you design well enough in the early stages of the construction, you can design regular spans, you can have sort of non-fixed joints so that at the end of the life it can be deconstructed and reused. So I'm going a little over time, so I'm trying to go through a little bit fast. Off-site construction is newish, but it's a way of building modular homes, a bit like how they've done with sort of large hotel buildings, where they kind of build the rooms and then they kind of snap them together, if you like, on site. Well, they're thinking about doing this on sort of a dwelling or a domestic nature, so you can really get the quality control done because it's off-site, good speed of delivery, less wastage because you're building exactly what you need off-site, and then you can bring it to site, and you haven't got any of that wastage and offcuts and things like that. Retrofit is a big part. Again, in the UK, we have got a lot of old buildings which are challenging to retrofit, but we shouldn't ignore them because they are going to be a significant part of our carbon emissions, those existing buildings. So we need to think about how we're retrofitting existing buildings and not just kind of concentrate on the new builds because they're easy, or easier, shall I say. So as I said, we need to get rid of our carbon from our existing housing stock. 22% of carbon emissions of domestic is from existing housing. So we really need to kind of work on reducing those. It can be difficult, but it's quite a big portion of our carbon emissions, so we need to look at those. We do get benefits of not having to use virgin materials. Is there a building that we can use? Is there a house? Is there an office building that we can reuse and convert that into some flats? And then we've got the major structure is there, so we're not actually having to have any virgin materials. We can add insulation and new heating systems to that without the need of sort of knocking something down and then rebuilding using virgin materials. Various retrofit measures that we can use. Cavity wall insulation, and again, this is probably a bit dictated by what country or regions you live in. We've got a lot of cavity walls in the UK. Cavity wall insulation is a great way to improve a building performance. Roof insulation, if you've got a cold roof space, a lot of people will have a roll of mineral wool in there, but probably mainly storage. So what can we add to that to improve that? Really easy, low cost win to do. We've got windows, air tightness, the mechanical stuff. Can we put a heat pump in there? Can we put some solar panels on the roof? So there's a lot we can do to our existing housing stock. There are cautions that we need to make when we're looking at them. Obviously that building's been there for quite a long time. Some might have solid walls, open fires, a lot of ventilation, so the building is really performing as it has always done. And then if we start making that building airtight, putting lots of insulation on it, we can end up with damp issues, moisture issues inside, not so great air quality, those sort of things. So it needs to be done with thought when we're doing that, not to cause further problems onto the building and its occupants. So what next? Again, sorry, this is a bit UK centric, but in the UK we've got the Future Home Standards, which is getting us to our sort of 75, 80%, perhaps zero carbon targets. We've had the building regulations last year updated, which was kind of a 35% improvement. That took a long time to come out due to various things, COVID being one. We had some fire regulations that needed to sort of take priority as well. So that kind of got dropped back a little bit. but we certainly, that's the aspiration. Whether we get there by 2025, difficult to see, being that that's approaching relatively fast. But that is, in the UK, the Future Home Standards is about getting buildings that are zero carbon. And that's it from me. Sorry, we overran a little bit, but it's quite a big topic and a lot to cover off. And I tried to condense an hour CPD into half an hour talk. It's a really wide topic and lots to discuss. Hope you found that useful.
Sorry? There's a couple of questions. Oh, perfect. So I just wanted to let everyone know that we are actually running a Slido, which is www.sli.do, and the password is #ATW. So if you'd like to post some questions there and we can certainly answer them, that would be wonderful. And in the meantime, I'd like to hand over to Nick Horton, who is going to be presenting on our ESG vision. Thank you very much, Nick. Yes, absolutely, Andrew. If you'd like to take a step up, and we can certainly run through your questions for you. There we go. Thank you very much.
So the first one is one of the biggest problems with concrete is that it's always virgin material. But materials like aluminium are easy and as good as virgin, easy to recycle. Would you repeat the question as well?
Yes, I mean, it is. And it probably, I don't want to say that one that should be avoided, but particularly when we're looking at ground floor structures that need to withstand. You might even have like a basement or perhaps an undercroft with parking, where you've got areas like that. There isn't really a product that you can use, so it's kind of fit for purpose in terms of its structural properties. So then we need to think about how can we reduce that embodied carbon in that concrete. So as I said, trying to reduce the cement in the property, working with the structural engineers to see what we can do to kind of reduce the amount of concrete. But there are places, particularly ground floor, where it's a good product and fit for purpose. I mean, at the end of life, it has a very good lifespan, but in theory, at the end of life, that can be broken up and used as a hardcore base for either the building that's already going to be there or moved off site and used somewhere else. So it has got, it can be reused. So it's got a long life, very, very structurally sound, and can be reused. But you're right, there is a heavy upfront embodied carbon as part of the process. But other things, you do have to think of other things in terms of if it's in a ground floor, timber's going to get damp and those sort of things. So there are lots of different things that you need to think about it, not just the embodied carbon element to it.
Sure. The second question in the audience is, you mentioned mould. Is thermal performance key, or if not?
It is. There are two parts to that question. One is probably the biggest thing is ventilation, and we've seen that a big part of ventilation in whilst we've had COVID, both in domestic and commercial, are really improving ventilation in the building. But if we're not getting rid of, if we've got an old building that's very, very air leaky, you can feel the breezes coming through the windows and through the floor voids. If you're sealing that up, you really, really need to get artificial ventilation. So you need trickle vents on the windows. You need extractor fans in the in high moisture rooms in kitchens and in bathrooms. And if you can stretch that far, if you could get a mechanical ventilation that does supply and extract, then that's almost the kind of pinnacle of where you want to be, because you're not getting heat loss. You're getting, if you've got a heat recovery system, you're getting the warm air is leaving, but it's getting exchanged with fresh air coming in. So a lot of new builds, particularly with new building regulations, we're going to see more mechanical ventilation systems with heat recovery, good air quality, but equally we've got good energy because we're not losing that heat through the ventilation. But yeah, it's that balance between a healthy building for the occupants, but one that doesn't lose a lot of energy. So we need to make sure that we're ventilating right. But we also need to think about the building fabric. Are we using the right thing? You know, if we use rigid polystyrene type insulation that's kind of traps moisture, that's not going to be great for an old building. But if we're using more natural timber fibres that can take in moisture, and then as it dries out, send moisture out to the outside again, or in through the inside and out through the ventilation system. So it's making sure that we're thinking of all of these different things that can impact on the building and its occupants, and making sure that design is right. And that's a little bit where the government struggle, because they are trying to use this process of getting a system that works for everything, so they can go and broad brush everything. But every building is different, and so we need to think of them as different buildings.
A question for me, if you don't mind. Part L, there's obviously new changes which have come in about the conservation of energy and so on.
Yes.
Particularly thinking of the requirement for taking photos and having evidence.
Yeah.
Could you say anything about that and how that's kind of affecting the approach generally in the market?
Yes. So that's it. I wouldn't say that it's resolved itself at the moment, for sure. Obviously, we've done quite a few SAP calculations, which in the UK is our kind of building regulation compliance methodology. And so where Passive House has always been very good is that they've always had this requirement for a lot of on-site oversight from the assessor, during the whole construction process. But it's it's a bit of a premium product, and people are willing to pay a little bit more. If you're doing SAP calculations, which generally every house needs, the fee comes down, so you can spend less time working on each of those properties, which is why the performance gap happens, because people, the developers, the SAP assessors, the building control officers, they don't have time to look at each of these buildings. They just don't have the time. So that's interesting to see how that works. But that is the theory, is that we are, rather than at the moment, or the old building regulations, rightly or wrongly, the developer would confirm that they built that house as they said they were going to build it at design stage, whether that's just signing a form, generally it was signing a form. So they could really do what they want. That's the wrong word. There wasn't that oversight of making sure they're doing it properly. They're just saying that they've tested it. We had air testing, which was that kind of part. But that's what it's meant to do: reduce the performance gap. It does focus people's minds. But if you've got a developer that's got on a plot, a development of 300 houses, and each one of those has to have photo evidence, it's who's meant to be taking the photos, who's paying for storing those photos. So it's definitely the right approach, but we need to see a lot of stuff coming out as people are doing this to actually how is it going to work. But it definitely needs to be done, because you only have to look on social media to see some of the finishes in some of the new build homes. I live in a new build home, and I won't name the developer, but it's an okay home that had an MVHR system, and there are MVHR systems on our site that have literally just got the ducting just loose in the loft, not extracted to the outside. So you think you're getting nice fresh air into the property, but actually you're just getting fibre and stuff from the loft. So, and building control supposedly sign that property off. So it's definitely needed to get rid of that performance gap. But we'll see how it works, because it's a big workload for somebody to deal with, and ultimately that's going to cost somebody to do that. I'm looking like an idiot now because I can't find it.
No, not at all. It's literally, yeah, you got it there. Perfect. So firstly, just wanted to thank you, Andrew, very much. It's certainly given us a great insight into carbon within the construction industry. I just wanted to reiterate that the Slido is running, and apologies, the actual password is #ASKAsk. So I'd really like to hand over now to Nick Horton from Sapphire Balcony, who is going to be presenting on our ESG 2030 vision. Thank you, Nick.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to those of you both in person and many of you virtually as well. Today we're launching our 2030 vision. It's the first time we've launched it formally, and we'll also be seeing lots more of this in the future as well. And I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour really as to kind of what our approach is and why we're taking that approach, and then also looking at what the parts and the pathway really which form our ESG vision are. So as a bit of an introduction into today, there's really three aspects of it. Firstly, we'll be looking at that approach we've chosen and the alternative approaches which are out there, if you like. We'll also be looking at what we've already done, and then we'll be looking at the roadmap into the future. So one of the first things we've realised when we started doing quite a thorough piece of research on this is this kind of a big scale of activity with ESG. The one end of the left-hand side of this scale here, you've got this focus on the now, which ultimately is very much about just doing the minimal amount to pay lip service to something, or in worse terms, if you like, actually greenwashing, intentionally misleading, because it's easier to do that than it is to actually invest in a proper ESG strategy. And I've seen a few smiles. I'm sure you've all seen these kind of statements. You know, we offer our customers the chance to offset the embodied carbon. You always wonder how many customers, if any, have ever bought credits from that sort of business. And again, net zero, cradle to grave, is it actually a possible reality? Carbon neutral maybe if you're buying enough offsets, but is net zero, as we've already looked at with Andrew's presentation. The opposite end of the scale, and really this is a direction which Sapphire are very much intending to go in, is making it a fundamental part of the activity, and not just the activity, but the culture which underpins everything the business is doing. And that really depends on two things. It's really having a firm culture in the first place, but secondly, aligning the ESG vision with that strong culture and the beliefs of the company in a direction. Because from what we've researched and from what we've already discovered in the previous year of activity in this really, is ESG is very much a journey. But it's like a journey on an underground map. There's lots of starting points, and there's lots of end points as well. And we might be able to identify where we are today, and that's obviously the first step in the ESG arena, if you like. But really choosing that destination is not a very easy thing. It could be choosing something very much focused on the climate. It could be on any aspect of the ESG. It might not even be choosing an ESG approach, but more of a CSR approach or something like that. So that was really the first one, and working out how ambitious do we want to be, because it is a journey. It's not a destination you're reaching quickly. And ultimately, if you're just moving one stop, really, you're probably on a journey of greenwashing. So that's one of the first things which we identified, really. So establishing where we were has involved measuring our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, understanding where we are as a business right now and have been over the last few years. A lot of work involved in doing that, and then obviously setting up a series of strategies to actually reduce these numbers. For example, one of the things which we've done a lot of is actually investing in EVs and the infrastructure for charging that, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Yes, we have offset the remaining emissions there to actually balance up that scale. And yes, theoretically we're carbon neutral, but it's not something we shout about. Why? Because carbon neutral really is just one of those points on the journey to net zero. And the net zero is very much our focus. Second point is the roadmap, and I'll be talking you through that, but it's identifying those impactful things which can be done. It's looking at what our objectives are and the values and the way we're going to measure those, and also publishing it so it's transparent and obvious at what we're doing. And thirdly, then demonstrating with evidence at every step of the journey to show that we're actually making meaningful progress. So far, one of the, from an E part of the ESG, the environmental and climate aspect of it, we've been very much committed to ISO 14001, and that continues to be the case. And we originally got it in 2009, so we've held it for over a decade already. Certainly reducing and offsetting any remaining residual emissions, if you like, will continue to be the case as we move forward to a true net zero approach. And as I mentioned, financially incentivising and investing. So for EVs, for example, we financially incentivise our staff here to choose that over a combustion engine. And unsurprisingly, the majority of cars now in our fleet, and continue to be so, the ones which we purchased or leased, continue to be EV vehicles. So it's quite an encouraging way of actually giving a better experience for staff, but also likewise reducing emissions and carbon footprint. From a social value point of view, social value has always been very close to our heart. As Tanya touched on at the beginning, the ATW Group's mantra is innovation to prosper the community. And that social value is a massive part of the community which we're creating value in. So as a few examples of that, investing in people has been very close to our heart in terms of actually supporting people, especially at times of need, whether that's physical need or whether that's supporting people in terms of education and progress. But one of the things we've done for quite a long while and continue to do is measure both our customer experience all the way through, step by step, every stage of the of each project, with the NPS rating, which NPS is much more difficult to achieve than a high rating of like a 98% customer satisfaction score. We also do the same with our staff as well. So we're regularly asking for feedback, and we're tweaking our strategies and the policies and so on to actually improve that staff NPS rating, because that's very much close to our hearts. Supporting charities is something which up until a few years ago we didn't really shout about. It's been something we've done a lot of, but we wanted to very much make sure that it was being done because we believed in it, not as a PR piece. We choose a new charity amongst the staff every quarter, and that's the charity which we will donate to. I believe at the moment it's the Crash Construction Charity, if I'm correct. And that's during last year we donated 0.35 million to charities, and we also 10x any staff donations. So any, for example, if a staff member gave £10, Sapphire would give £100 to that same charity as part of our commitment for supporting and rewarding activities like that. So what is our vision? Where are we going in the future? From an environmental point of view, very much our focus is about walking the walk, not just setting out easy to say talk. And by doing that, that's really about being accountable publicly. So there's transparency for our customers to hold us to account as well. We have committed already to science-based targets. I'm not sure if you've all heard of those before, but science-based targets is basically something which I'm going to touch on a bit later in the presentation, but it's an ambitious approach. There's not very many construction companies in the world which have actually committed to it, and as far as we understand, we're the first balcony company to ever commit to it, and hopefully more do commit to it too. And we will continue to have ISO 14001 and PAS 2060, something we've more recently been going through the accreditation process of, which is a carbon neutral standard. From a social and governance point of view, very much about partnerships and collaboration to reducing the interfaces, for example, the fabric first approach, working with architects at an early stage to design out thermal breaks and so on. We've been investing in technology platforms and things which will improve productivity, and we've also been looking at various other aspects of things, for example, bringing the industry together in forums like this and on live streams to actually learn about the kind of approaches and share tips and best practice to encourage others. So many of you have probably seen the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. These are set out in 2015, and as part of that, apologies, just go back to that. As part of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were set out originally by the UN, we closely looked at these and looked at which ones of these are the ones which we can impactfully make a difference to within our business. For example, there's some areas like peace, justice and strong institutions is something which we felt wasn't something which we could particularly feed into as a company, but certainly other things like well-being and health is something we're already passionate about, and we've aligned and picked 8 of those objectives as part of our Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll be measuring ourselves against. So those 8 cover quite a range of activities across the ESG spectrum, and will be the ones which we will every year we're committing to financially report on along with our accounts in December. So the first one is no poverty. So for us, that's a lot about supporting charities, particularly charities like Crash, which are helping with that kind of activity, and other personal needs too. Second is good health and well-being, which is for us the NPS score. We're very proud of our 88.2 NPS score. Now, NPS works on a scale that you measure your promoters, anyone who scores you 9 and 10, you measure anyone who scores you less than 6 or less as a detractor, and that means that to get a score, a high score is very, very difficult because you've got a scale of -0 to +100. Just putting that in context, customer satisfaction scorings on companies which are very, very high, very efficient companies like Amazon, for example, would generally sit around 70 to 80% as an NPS score. So that's something which we will continually be trying to improve. Quality of education and running forums like this, the Resibuild Roadshow and any other Resibuild events like the one which is being hosted in Wembley Stadium in October, are very much about bringing quality education and meaningful speeches and activities which will improve the industry more generally. We have then chosen the decent work and economic growth, which we're very much measuring about the productivity aspect, and that's something which we'll continue to report on. Industry innovation and infrastructure. Now, our belief is that innovation is very much what's going to underpin the reduction to net zero of our products and products in general terms. We looked at the carbon scale, and I'll be looking at it a bit more in a second, but that's very much key to what we're doing, and I believe there's going to be a tour of our R&D facilities here a bit later on, so you can see firsthand, those of you who are here in person, as to what those products are and how that will work. Sustainable cities and communities is one which for us is about reducing the number of people having to travel to cities, indirectly also reducing carbon footprint as well as people travel. 12 is about the responsible consumption and production, so again that's linked in with innovation. And number 13, which is the climate action one, which for us is about both our company emissions and also our products related embodied carbon. So in numbers, in 2030, our vision is that we'll be selling 20,000 balconies in 2030. We'll have that predominantly, at the moment we're based in the UK, but we also have recently expanded overseas. We work in Canada, we work over in Netherlands, in Ireland, and as far away as New Zealand. We will have 0 emissions of our scope 1, 2 and 3. We'll have 0% of our net zero being offset unless there's residual emissions which we can't actually reduce to 0 in itself. We've chosen the 8 SDGs. That's our primary focus for the time being. As things go change between 2023 and 2030, that may or may not change, but we're going to be reviewing that continually as we go through. We've committed to science-based targets. The green line, which I'll show you in a second, we will have 100% of our vehicles as green energy vehicles, most likely to be the EV rather than the hydrogen, which mentioned is probably still a way off. And we will continue to have ISO 14001 in place. So I've mentioned the science-based targets on the right-hand side as our commitment. There we have are going through the assessment process and working through that over the coming months as well. But in essence, this is about the trajectory which was set out originally for the heating the overheating of the earth and how this can be reduced on a sustainable line. So this is what we've committed to, is actually reducing it in line with science-based targets, and that's what we'll continue to do as a company. We looked at the stages of a building. We've taken this context in the context of balconies. So the A1 to A5 is the balcony-related embodied carbon, and we've very much been measuring that. But stages B1 to B7, a couple of those aren't particularly relevant to balconies because obviously balconies don't have, like a boiler, aren't actually actively using energy. C1 to C4, and then the D, where it becomes an actual circular economy. So how are we approaching this? Well, ultimately, we're looking at this again very much from a data point of view. We've already got EPDs in place, but we've split out our EPDs into anchors and balconies. And the reason this is meaningful really is that we're working with clients to make sure that they can calculate it for their building. So for example, some balconies will have more than 2 anchors. They may have 3 or 4 if it's a particularly big balcony. And then the balcony is done per working out back to a square metre. So it's an average EPD, so people can calculate the size of their balcony, the number of anchors, and get the accurate amount. One of the things we did realise is that actually EPDs is as good as the structure is and the benchmarks and so on. In analysing a number of different balconies, it can be or different products outside of balconies as well. It can easily be misdeclared as well, which means that you can have just perhaps a platform, if you like, and no guarding around it, no anchors and so on, or you might have the balcony but without the anchors. And unless you put all those together, you don't really get the true picture of it. So understanding the scale of it, not just for embodied carbon, but also the whole balcony life, is quite important to our customers, and therefore that's the approach we've taken on doing it. We also continue to measure our scope 1, 2 and 3, as I mentioned. We are doing this in line with PAS 2060 now as well. So this is about measuring and understanding and reducing those, and we're working with our supply chain to encourage them to do the same as well for their company emissions. That's all from me. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, I think we can all agree that that's a really interesting presentation, and it's lovely to see such a company taking such a serious stance on ESG. So thank you very much, Nick. We're going to take a short break for lunch, but we will be coming back with another presentation from a gentleman called Keith Hole, who's from TSM. So we welcome you back at 1 o'clock, where we will be starting our live stream again. But in the meantime, thank you very much again, Andrew. Thank you, Nick. And we'll see you back in a bit. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. So we've just had a few questions over the lunch break, which I'd like to ask our presenters. So the first one being, the cost of housing is preventing other than whole house heating and creates cold rooms where the dew point causes precipitation of moisture. So I don't know if you can comment on that, Andrew?
Yes. Run that past me again.
Yeah, certainly. The cost of energy is preventing other than whole house heating and creates cold rooms where the dew point causes precipitation of moisture.
Yes, there is a real risk with that, because if people are trying to reduce their energy bills by turning down the heating, which inevitably that's what people do, then you end up with those condensation risks, and it's a big factor that we've got with these increasing energy costs, which is why retrofitting of the existing housing stock is so important, and it's also why the government should do more to help retrofit those in fuel poverty, because it just, not only is there a cost implication for them running that house, but also there is a health implication in terms of, as they say, with condensation, mould growth, and just poor air quality. So it's all very well saying, retrofit, but there is a cost to that. And if you're already in fuel poverty, how do you find that cost? So there's a big role there for the governments to play in terms of funding that.
Very interesting, thank you very much. So the next question, could you explain where most carbon would be?
Well, that is a good question, and there is a mix, as I said, in the embodied carbon and the operational carbon. And I would suggest, we are looking at a lot of the carbon being locked in at the design and build stage. So we must get a grip of that. And as I said, the UK government at least is bringing embodied carbon into the policy mixing, so that we can consider, the embodied carbon cost of building. Operational carbon probably is a smaller amount than that embodied carbon, which is why using the existing housing stock is quite important. But obviously, when you're running those houses, it's the operational carbon and therefore the operational cost that is sort of in people's mind rather than the embodied carbon. But I would suggest that we need to, not tackle one individual. We need to look at the whole picture and tackle both of those together.
Yeah, you certainly raised some interesting points there, so thank you. Are metal or concrete products ever going to become net zero?
I don't think they can be net zero without offsetting, and it depends on the quality of that offsetting. There are, and I don't tar them all with the same brush, but there are different offsetting schemes and carbon credits, some being better than others. So they can be through offsetting, but we just need to be careful of the offsetting programs that we're using to make sure it's a true offsetting and not just using the word greenwashing there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And Nick, this is a question for you. Where can we access the ESG information for Sapphire?
So the ESG information we will be launching shortly on our website. There is some brief overviews at the moment, but watch the space as the Roadshow unfolds. We'll be launching more of that information. But there is a document which will be published as well, or has been published, and will shortly be available. There is also, we've made the commitment to publish it every year with our financial accounts as well. If it's okay, I'd also like to probably answer those two questions from a balcony perspective.
Yeah, of course.
The first question, if you can remind me.
Yeah, certainly. Could you explain where most carbon would be?
Yeah, so from a balcony perspective, if we just roll it back a stage, we're talking obviously about buildings more generally. It very much depends on the product itself. If you take a car, for example, a diesel engine car or something like that, the majority of those emissions are probably going to be during the duration of that life cycle. and some buildings might be like that if they're badly insulated and so on, but constructed of timber, for example. If you've got a scenario where you're actually buying an electric vehicle, majority of that carbon footprint is actually going to sit in the embodied carbon most likely. And I think it does very much depend on what the building product is. In terms of balconies, a balcony product, about 85% of a balcony throughout the whole lifespan of the building is actually in the materials. So if you can reduce materials and make a difference there, that makes a massive impact to the amount of balcony, the footprint of the actual balcony. So for example, designing out one arm or one stud bracket and so on will make quite a big impact. You can reduce quite a lot of the metal out of it. Transport is less than 2%. If you designed out half that transport, if you design out 79–80% of that transport, you're still only making a very, very small marginal change. So it does very much depend on what the product is, but from a balcony point of view, don't focus on anything other than the materials, because ultimately that's where the big numbers are, and that's actually where you can reduce it quite simply by designing and coordinating early on.
That's really interesting, Nick. So the second question, are metal or concrete products ever going to become net zero?
I can't answer for concrete ones. Metal ones, companies like us cannot impact the amount of material availability and the recycled product content really in a lot of the materials we buy. We have been doing a big piece of research into it. You can get lots of people which will promise you 70% recycled content, but then when you try getting certificates to actually prove that that is 70%, it all starts falling apart. So we're not offering a product to the marketplace which is claiming to be highly recycled, and it very much does depend on what you're buying, because buying aluminium extrusion with the high recycled content is something which you can do quite simply. Buying sheet materials, buying other components for things like fixings and for thermal brakes, a whole different ball game as well. So there's certain products which can be highly recycled content. We have actually started a truly circular economy with the items in factories which are actually damaged. We've started testing, sending them back to extruders and actually getting them melted down and put into it, so we're not using virgin material, and we know that what the source of that original material was. We know it's truly recycled. But that is something we're experimenting with at the moment. We've sent shipments over to the extruders and so on. But ultimately, it does depend on the whole industries moving. Andrew showed us some slides of concrete reduction over a 60-year. We've seen similar for kind of fossil fuel-free steel and so on. Aluminium the same again. But availability is a massive thing. Affordability is a really big thing as well. So until those two things have been sorted out, we're probably not going to see very much of that directional move towards net zero. And I thought the point Andrew made earlier was really important about the first 30% is quite easy to reduce in many circumstances, but actually it's that next 30 which is much more difficult for anyone in any industry really.
Sure. Thank you very much. That's definitely very interesting. So obviously ESG is a very hot topic at the moment, and as we've seen, Sapphire have just released their 2030 vision, which leads me on nicely to introduce you to Keith Hole from TSM, and he will be presenting risk management, squaring the circle to drive ESG. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Let me just... There we are.
That's all right. Which way up do I hold it? So, I'm going to have to work out, first of all, how to navigate the thing. It's really great to be here. It's great to have people joining us from online as well. And really, I'm probably taking a very different approach to talking about ESG here, because ESG is one of these things that everyone at the moment, especially financial institutions, are looking at. But when you then take that to a board of a company and say, well, you know, we need to put these ESG items into place, it's how do you actually integrate that into their business systems? How do you embed it? How do you get that chain of custody right from procurement through to end of life? I think interesting point from you is I come from a construction background, and it's how many companies are considering the carbon loading of demolition of their products at the end of it, especially in the building industry. They talk about the design, the cost of building the project, the cost of assembling the project. They talk about the lifestyle, but we do have to knock that down at the end And where are we actually building in, and how are we driving these demolition contractors to really build in that ESG agenda and actually look at their carbon production from when they're recycling? And that is something that, from an interest, is an interesting point of view. I am terrible. I do go off topic a lot. You are allowed to interrupt me. This is perfectly allowed. If you have a question, don't wait till the end. I am going to try and stay still as well, because I do move around a lot. But really, I specialise in going into companies and helping them look at their risk holistically. And one thing the ESG agenda has pushed is internal carbon pricing. And the fact is you can, if you've got a good mature company that's already subscribed to your ISOs, then you can use that risk register to actually build those costs in and drive that through procurement. So I specialise in quite a few. I'm going to try and remember a few of them. I've got 45, I've got 14, I've got 9, I've also got 45,003, and I've got 50,001. So I've kind of got the core ISO standards required for ESG. But I think, again, the conversation we need to have is about, is ESG, because they talk about environment, social and governance, but is that environment actually really, it should be sustainability, and it's looking at a sustainability from a business, from about staff, about procurement, about how you impact the environments you work in, so there's internal recruitment and things like that. So I do try and get people to stop thinking environment, because when they think environment, they think trees, they think water. They don't think the environment that people work in, the environment that people operate. So if you're going into an area, and I work with large infrastructure companies, going into an area to put in new fibre optic, dig up roads, do they bring their workforce with them, or do they upskill, and therefore through the ESG, through the social side of it, are they increasing that knowledge in that area, the quality of life of people working in those areas? And I did tell you, I've gone off topic already. I haven't even got to my second slide. So we're going to go there, because otherwise we could be here all day. Okay? Does this work? Does it look? No? How do I do this? You've got to help me on this technology here. I can see myself there. See? Is there an up and down key on here?
Not sure.
You're not sure? Tell you what, that's it, you see. He thinks he... I knew I would be beaten by technology. That's it. Fantastic. My slides are up. Let's see if we can find the rest of the presentation. That's me. I think if we go to there. We've definitely got some challenges here. All right. I knew something. Please, if anyone's got a joke, you're quite welcome to tell it right now. The only ones I know I don't think are actually suitable for, where's presentation? From beginning, but it's gone into. Do you know what? I'm going to plug my laptop in. Sorry. So, ESG, while we're talking about that, is what I did find interesting is that you do have charging points out the back for vehicles. And that is a challenge. So I have, as part of my ESG journey, I've actually gone plug-in hybrid because I can't trust the electric just yet. I can't rely on it. People ask me to come to presentations at short notice and I can never make it in time. But, excuse the desktop, it is a mess. Right. But it is one of those things is when you're looking at ESG is understanding what ESG means to the board and means to the business. And the key thing we have to understand is what does it actually... I haven't got my glass on either. Have we got a thumbs up there? Brilliant. Right, so there you go. So this is me. I don't often use all my post-nominals because, to be honest, some people think I've just made them up. My favourite one out of all of them, the last three, now you do get a prize if you know what the last three stand for. British Institute of Innkeeping. So originally they were my first post-nominals and I still use them. I originally used to run pubs for a living. You can't believe that from the way I present, but there you go. But now I am a chartered risk and safety consultant. I have various, I'm a BSI associate consultant, so I help people get their standards, follow continual improvement. And as well as that, I am at the moment trying to become a chartered environmentalist. I want that trifecta of triple chartered across there, and hopefully people will believe that I know what I'm talking about. So that's me. I've been in this industry for about 20 years now, and various moved around, and I found myself dealing really in risk. So upside and downside risk. So we're going to have a risk lesson first. Do we know the difference between an upside and a downside risk? It is written there. So when you look at your risk register, loads of companies go for an ISO standard and their risk register is all downside risk. It's all about things that can go wrong. This could happen, that could happen. We need to invest money to stop people falling off ladders, i.e. training. We need to invest money to make sure that people are safe on the road. We need to invest money because we've got to mitigate against changes in legislation. They're all downside. Very few companies, especially entrepreneurial ones, look at upside risk, but they do it all the time. So an upside risk was, we want to move and take over that region of the country. We want to win that contract. They all cost you money to invest in. So it is very much, you've got to look at on a risk register, do question yourself, do you have upside and downside risks? Do you put in there about your ambitions and your objectives to grow? Because one of the things we need to look at with ESG is your objectives. ESG says, what are your impacts and objectives as a business? Now, your objectives should be driven by your risk register. And that's perhaps where we'll get onto internal carbon pricing. Because your risk register ultimately is the things that could hurt your business or things. So that's your risk tolerance. Now, what we need to do is we need to consider, because your objectives you need to spend money on, don't you? So if you're going to spend money on something, there should be a reason why you spend money. You just don't spend money as a business because it's a nice thing to do. We're not philanthropic. We are here to be in business. So therefore, your risk register should drive those objectives. So when you're looking at your risks within a business, which will, I bet if you've already got a risk register, there will be impacts in there related to your environmental drive, cost of fuel going up, cost of materials going up, things like that. That's why we need to make sure we've got a good, solid risk register that is reviewed on a regular basis. It doesn't need to be 1,000 lines long. It should only really be the stuff that you know you need to worry about. But do make sure that on your risk register, you've got your upside, which ESG feeds into, because if Bank of England are looking at £100 per tonne of carbon, that's their prediction. If carbon prices go up, how much is the paper that gets delivered to your office going up? How much is food that gets delivered to your office? How much is the cost of sustainable products going to go up in price because you have carbon within them? So if carbon pricing goes up, have you considered that in your risk register to make sure that you're looking not just now at your CapEx cost, but in the future as your TOTEX, and building that into that long trail? So that's just a little bit on upside and downside risk. I could do many more. But the next thing we're going to look at is, we got that one there, is where is your risk focus? So many risk registers are weighted towards your reputation or your financial, your health and safety. But one of the things ESG looks at is actually, when were you last prosecuted? When was it last? Look at Thames Water with their recent prosecution, or Southern Water, 94 million. They've just been fined for a sewage. That's very much where your reputation is. BP, Deepwater Horizon. Now, if you're an investor and you're looking at a company from the ESG point of view in a bank, that is reputational risk. We don't want to invest in bad things. So many people have always looked reputational, financial, health and safety. They've not so much looked at your carbon use and your ESG. It's been on the other side. But what we want to do is to look at these things on one risk register for the entire business and look much more how we're looking on the right side of that slide.
Can I just chip in a little bit?
Of course, did I not say please interrupt me? You don't even need to put your hand up. Go, Keith, I have a question. Answer me, go on, what do you need?
Yeah, so how can we balance it out? I don't know if that was the next step, but how can we balance it out? Because I think you mentioned that most companies or most organizations are more thinking about their reputation, financial and health and safety, but how can we leverage it so that it balances out with the carbon pricing and the ESG?
So these are things you can build in. So a normal risk register will have one column that has likelihood, probability. But what you can do is you could add another column and you could have the likelihood of what happens if carbon goes up. So you could have that column, and therefore what you do is you have two likelihood columns and one probability column. So therefore, and you take the highest of value. So just by subtle changes, you can do this. But the other thing you can do is recording on a risk register is having the conversation with the board about how they think about risk and what risks do they consider. So it's, if you are a good company already using risk registers to manage your business, it is very much about having that conversation to make sure people are thinking about ESG, and we'll come to it on the next slide, kind of some of the things that could impact your business, and making sure they consider that when they look at fleet purchasing. Now, fleet purchasing is two ways. If you're growing a business, that's an upside risk. So you need to invest money to achieve your growth. If you don't invest money to achieve that growth, it's not going to happen. So your risk is going to realise itself. But when you buy the fleet, and I am going to be very cheeky here, if you buy a fleet right now, the government's going, oh, go electric. Bet you, have you got a tracker system on your vans? Things like that.
Don't really have many vans.
But if, all right, so companies have tracker systems. Every single company I've worked for has a tracker system, and in that tracker system, all these transport teams have put a new report in that says possibility to turn electric. That's the big thing, drive electric. Where's that coming from? It's coming from the drive from the government to say, we're going to turn you electric. We're going to get rid of diesel and petrol. But also, actually, if you look at it, if you operate in London, your vehicle probably never does more than 200 miles a day. It goes from the depot, goes to the customer's house, comes back. So a lot of vehicle tracking systems now have a report that says opportunity to electrify a vehicle. And it will look at that vehicle, it will look at the distance it travels, it will look at how often it travels and what it does, and also how long it parks up in places for, and go, actually, that vehicle is absolutely perfect to become electrified. Now, as we've talked earlier, the loading of carbon on electric vehicles is very front end, but that's down to battery produce. If you were to look at the new vehicles that BMW and Lexus are looking at, which are hydrogen fuel cell, so they're still an electric vehicle, they've got electric motors, there's no internal combustion engine on there, but those electric vehicles have a hydrogen fuel cell, which you can fill up with 6 litres of hydrogen and will give you a 500-mile range. The issue with carbon at the moment in fleets is not electric vehicles, it's how do you store the energy on that electric vehicle to power the motors. The motor technology is incredibly efficient. So there's a company I've just come from this morning, are looking at building hydrogen generation plants at their offices or their depots to power their HGV fleet, because hydrogen can not only be used in internal combustion engines, it can also be used in hydrogen fuel technology, which is what BMW is looking at the moment. Imagine the government in 5 years' time gets a new Prime Minister, could happen, and that Prime Minister goes, actually, we've looked at everything and all these targets we were going to do, and we're saying we're getting rid of electric vehicles by 35, and we decided we're getting rid of electric vehicles and diesel vehicles, and everyone's going to have hydrogen, and we're going to do scrappage scheme for petrol, and we're going to put hydrogen infrastructure in. If you're a company that's just invested in your fleet and got 3 to 5 year leases, you're now stuck with a load of vehicles that don't comply with the government's want. And that's what you've got to put into your risk register and how you think about it. How do we do this? What are the moods? And it does take a significant amount of horizon scanning. So sometimes when I do go into companies and they go, yeah, all our vehicles are going to be electric. And I go, yes, but your salesmen do 500 miles a day and stop for a grand total of an espresso every time they stay still. An electric vehicle is not going to do. Get my super diesel. You know, from a carbon point of view, a super diesel, but if you've got Joe working in stores that is literally driving 50 miles a day to and from, and the van sits at his stores next to a lovely 3-phase outlet where it can get 22 kilowatt out, and that sits there, and that's all that van does, and he's, you know, the van's stationary for 80% of its time, get him an electric vehicle. He doesn't need a diesel. You've got things like the ID Buzz commercials, you've got the Vivaro commercials. So this is where we mustn't just put all our eggs in one basket and go, we're going electric from an ESG point of view. And it's getting people to think about risks like that. I think I've done about 3 slides on one slide here, but we're going to move on now. Okay? So there you go. This is you've probably seen this lots of places. Now this is a particular one, just looking at your different areas. And I sometimes do this with board. I print this out on a big sheet of paper. We get post-it notes and I go, right, how does this topic affect and where does it affect your area of the business? Because people often get lost with ESG. They think it's here. They think ESG is all environment. It's not. ESG is about sustainability of business, sustainability of the environment, sustainability of staff, so getting your staff churn rate down. Some companies, believe it or not, exclude what they class as involuntary redundancies. So you might have a member of staff that goes AWOL and you can't get hold of them and you go, well, that's an involuntary sacking. We can't do anything about that. And you go, but hold on a second, under ESG, I want to know about these people that just do not turn up to work the next day. Because people don't just not turn up to work because they love being there. There'll be a reason. People don't leave jobs because of the job. People leave the job because of the manager. And that's why, you know, so I went into a company this morning and they went, yeah, we've got 1.1 is our attrition rate. I went, what about all these involuntary leavers? Oh yeah, but that takes up to 2.6. I said, so actually half of your leavers leave because, and you don't know why. Why have they done that? And if from an ESG point of view, if we get right over there to the social side, health, safety and sustainable workforce, they've left. And they've not only have they left, they've left and they can't even be bothered to tell you they're leaving. So from an ESG point of view, I'd say you were scoring lower than you should be. So it is when you're looking there. And then especially when you start talking to the board and say you come under governance and I want to know about your diversity and why have you not got, you know, suitable, let's not use diversity, let's use inclusive. Because I'm a great believer in diversity and equality, but it should be equity of opportunity, not equality. Because so I'll give you an example, bricklayers, there are lots and lots of female bricklayers coming into the market now. But you're not getting many female hod carriers because a hod carrier's job is very strength related. A bricklayer is very skill related. So therefore it doesn't matter what size you are as a bricklayer if you can lay bricks. But if I'm asking you to carry, you know, 30 kilos around a site all the time, so you don't get, so this is when we must look at equity of opportunity and actually allow people to get the job they want to get. There should never be any barriers to anyone being whatever they want to be. And especially with boards, when you're in the construction industry, the pipelines for people to come up into those roles haven't been there, because a lot of people on construction boards have grown up into those through the fact that they've come up through the pipeline through the business. So you're not really going to see those pipelines appear for probably another 20 years. That's when we're going to get through. But the only way we can do that is to have equity of opportunity right now, to allow people to get on that rung and actually get on that journey to the board. So it is one of those things. But there you go. So that's which are your biggest impacts. Print it out, stick it on a wall, post-it notes, pens, cake. People love it, you know. That's what you need to do. But then what we need to do is, again, this is where we've got to look at your risk tolerance versus your risk appetite. So your risk tolerance is how much money you're willing to lose as a business, whereas your risk appetite is how much money you're willing to risk to achieve that growth. So again, we're kind of slightly different from upside and downside, but your risk tolerance says, I'm prepared to suffer this amount of reputational damage. But on the other hand, your risk appetite is to actually achieve my goals, I'm willing to, you know, lose that amount of money. Because it's always money at the end of the day. We only have one pot of gold. And this is the challenge with ESG, is getting entrepreneurs to realise it costs money to do stuff and to be better. You've got to invest. You've got to look at the whole journey. They will realise efficiencies, but like everything, you know, when you buy a new car, you've got to buy the car to get the 60 miles, 100 miles to the gallon out the car. So it is about that investing to win. And then looking at the impacts and opportunities and taking them on that journey. So when we're driving the ESG agenda, I know I keep looking at there because my glasses are over there in that bag, so I can't actually see this screen at all. No, it's fine. As long as you don't mind me keep turning around, I'm happy. But this, look at that. Can anyone read that? No. So this is the challenge. But so when we're looking at pricing of ESG impacts, so the impact of ESG, if you've said that's going to be my impact, you know, I keep going back to carbon pricing, but what is the cost of that impact on your business? And if you don't address it, what's it going to cost you in the long run? Especially with policies changing, the drive coming through. And I know we talked about in terms of construction, can you imagine that they decide that they're going to tack the cost of demolition of construction onto the cost of your carbon as well, because it's not there currently. So resilience, are all your eggs in one basket? So again, we're looking at, have you suddenly electrified your entire fleet and found out that the substation's now got to be upgraded, and your local electricity board has said, yeah, that's really good. Yeah, we can put you in like a 300 amp supply, but we're also going to have to fit you a substation down the road to supply this. So I've got a plug-in socket at home, but I have to have a load balancer, because if my car asks for too much power, you know, I might find my heating goes off, or I might find my lights dim, or I can't watch television, because most houses were built when there were 60 amp supplies in houses. Now, I've worked in an industry, we did a housing development, and we dug up this brownfield site, and it had a substation there, and we found cables from 1902 that were in wooden conduits. And you're thinking, this is the stuff that's powering the future. So you might think that your street's a new development, but your nearest substation might still be using wax-oiled three-phase paper that was designed to run, you know, the local Lord Mayor's house, you know, from an old coal gas site. So it's not the infrastructure here, it's the infrastructure and how that supply's getting in. And this is the big thing at the moment. Electricity companies are really worried about load balancing. If everyone went electric tomorrow, we could have a few changes. And just think back when they were talking about rotor cuts in the summer, and you get a phone call from a member of staff saying, love the new car, can't come in though because they turned my power off last night. And this is the infrastructure. So they're putting batteries into houses now. They're using solar power to power the house. But this is the thing, these are the stopgaps we've got, is yes, you could electrify your entire fleet, find out that suddenly there's power outages and no one can actually get to work to do any work. So it's a balance out, and you've got to build those into your risk matrix. So horizon scanning, what's coming down the line? You know, hydrogen is definitely coming. Hydrogen, if they get hydrogen fuel cells to work, the whole issue about mining for lithium for batteries is going to disappear very quickly, because hydrogen can be generated from an electricity supply and water. So most petrol stations, service stations, whatever we're going to call them, because they could be electricity stations too, most charging points, they generate the hydrogen on site and store it in tanks. So you've also got the fact that hydrogen is a better carbon usage because it can be developed through solar power, wind power and water, and developed on site, stored on site, and then you can put it into vehicles, both internal combustion and from hydrogen fuel cells. So you can tailor the type of motive force you need from the vehicle, and it doesn't matter where the fuel's coming from because it's the same fuel. So I think JCB are looking at multi-fuel engines at the moment. But I think, again, that's because they've been given lots of money to do it by the government. But that's my cynical side coming out. Do all your teams realise their impact of ESG on the board objective? Does your procurement team, every time they buy paper for your office, say, hey, I'm buying paper, can you give me the FSC certificate so I can put that into my chain of custody file? Did you know your printer paper has FSC certificates on?
Yeah.
And where are they stored? So that's your chain of custody when you buy pallets. So this is where the procurement team, because procurement team love a sale, so they will always drive, and they probably think, but that paper's the same as that paper. But then you're saying, but you know, where is my chain of custody to demonstrate? And so procurement teams are on the biggest learning curve because they need to start asking the question about what's the carbon cost of getting that paper to my office? Where's the upfront cost? So I know I'm picking on you, but that's because you're in the front row. It's your own fault, and you're wearing a blue suit. And anyone that wears a blue suit, fair game. So what you've got to look at is things like that. Is where is the load of carbon? And the procurement teams. So another example that could cover you on both sides is PPE. Greenhams, Arco, a lot of the big companies do a new for old policy. So you can get your PPE, when it's run out, it gets collected, it gets sent back to the supplier, they shred it, and they use it as a recyclable material. But there's been a thing lately to get rid of local stores and have drop shipping for PPE. So suddenly, you've got lots of vans running around with small packages, when actually if you've got a depot, everyone could have come here and picked their PPE up. So we have, in terms of efficiency, created more carbon, not for the business directly, and I forget which scope. I'm going to say, does anyone remember their scopes? Where would that come under? Which scope was that? It's probably scope 3, isn't it? But that's the challenge you've got. So you've generated more carbon than that from changing in procurement routes. But actually, let's go back to the PPE. You've also improved your corporate image, and you've reduced the chance of distraction burglaries from people that have been sacked that might be wearing your PPE. So you're actually winning it, and this is where on the risk register, thinking about it, yes, we need to remove PPE from people when they return, but actually if we do that, that also reduces the chance of people doing a distraction burglary because they haven't got the PPE. So it's about that whole life cycle. What other improvements are going to bring to the business? So relocating depots for vans, if you've got a lot of vehicles or a lot of fleet and you move your depots, your staff haven't got to travel as far, they're closer to the customer, it's going to reduce your CO2 loading, but also it's going to reduce the number of particulates in the air, which is going to reduce occupational cancer for people that live along busy roads. And it's also going to reduce the fatigue of your staff because they're not driving 2 hours to get to the van and back from the van. It's all local. So you've got these other things that fit into all those camps just by thinking about where we put things and how we put it in the right way. And then finally, got 2 there. How do you integrate ESG in your procurement processes? I think we've covered that. You know, procurement need to realise they are the start of the CO2 chain. You know, they really are. When they purchase stuff, it's not about the end goal, it's about what it costs to get that product to us and have they got that chain of custody information available. And then developing objectives from your impacts. Let's spend money on stuff that we decide as objectives. Let's not have an objectives meeting where we put a board up and we write down all these objectives. And then no one's looked at the risk register. Because if it's on the risk register, it should definitely be an objective of yours to fix. And that is part of the Deming cycle and that plan, do, check cycle. So I've got this one here. Where do we think we are as businesses? If we were to look at that, where do you think we're fitting on there? And believe it or not, a lot of companies on the very start of their ESG journey are actually between 2 and 3. They think they're much higher because they've got well-being. They've had fresh fruit in the office for at least 3 years. You know, people are working from home, so that, yeah, we're all over this ESG. And when you actually look at it, you go, but you're not. You're doing the things that which have given you a good public perception, a good thing. You know, things you can shout and go, going, yeah, we get fruit in the office every day. And then you've got the guy in the van going, yeah, I work at a depot in a van and I've never got fruit. Or even better, one thing people did for well-being is they brought physiotherapists into the office, or they had office yoga. And do you know what? That was amazing, because in the office, everyone's going, this is great. We've got fruit. I get a massage at lunch. I've got yoga. I do this. And again, the guy that's in the van is going, yeah, that'd be nice. But he doesn't get it because it's centralised. So we've got to make sure what we apply holistically. We apply it to everyone. So a lot of them think they're down there, but when you then look at the social bit of ESG, they're only doing it in a little tiny square patch of the area. So you'd be glad to know we're nearly at the end now. We are there. So this really is a kind of a bit of an ESG roadmap. And I think most companies are around here. They haven't got a sustainability manager. They've got an HSEQ team, which has got a big H, a big S, maybe a medium-sized Q, but trust me, the environment bit is a very little E. They're health and safety people that have been told, yeah, can you make sure they don't spill stuff on site? That you need a sustainability manager that looks at this as a whole and drives your ESG agenda. So ISO 50001, you get over 36 million, you're going to be looking at ESOS. ESOS requires you either every year to do an ESOS submission, or if you look at 50,001, that enables you as a business to look holistically. The other challenge of 50,000, it's a 3-year cycle with surveillance visits rather than a yearly report, although they do get quite upset if you don't have continual improvement each year. You do have to benchmark. Implementation of energy targets. What are energy targets? When we talk about energy, what do we actually consider? And then impacts and opportunities. So that's really your first thing. Let's baseline. Let's work out what we're doing. Then you can look at things like B Corp, ISO 14003, which you've got 45001, fits in really nicely about looking at well-being, putting intervention policies. And if you've got an ESG, not an ESG, this is ESG, if you've got an employee support, what's it called? I can't remember. I've lost all my acronyms now. But if you're looking at your employee support lines, where people can ring up and say, I'm having a bad day through Bupa, well, actually, that fits into your 45,003. It's actually just making sure it's in place and structured way to support staff. And then actually do some ESG reporting and say, look, these are our targets, this is how far we've got along.
So does this include mental health first aiders as well?
Absolutely. But remember, so, mental health first aiders. The First Aid at Work Act actually says nothing about physical or mental health. It just says you need first aid. And everyone always confuses that with a green box on the wall. But actually, if you work in an office and you're under a lot of stress, the most likely thing you're going to need is a plaster for your finger. You're far more likely to need mental health first aid. So when you do your first aid risk assessment, it should be different from people that are operational to people that are knowledge workers. But people always go, well, I need 10 first aiders in this office. And also, the people that volunteer to be mental health first aiders really probably aren't the people you need to be mental health first aiders. So I'm going to let you into a little secret here. Believe it or not, all right, I am actually clinically depressed. And this is what a clinically depressed person looks like. I've had the little certificate from my doctor and everything. But I manage it. I'm good. And one of my colleagues went to a mental health first aid training. My partner went to mental health first aid training. And the trainer's like, oh, has anyone ever had to deal with someone that's suicidal and this? And she's gone, yep. And you saw the trainer go, oh, no. I actually have had no one ever say yes to that question. Can you imagine there? And it is. And I said, someone said to me about mental health. I said, oh, yeah, I've done my mental health first aid training. I said, yeah, that's good. I said, you might have done the theory. I said, but trust me, I've done the practical. So it is one of those things. You can laugh at mental health. Mental health is hilarious. If we have a coffee in a bit, I will tell you some of the things I've done when I've not been well, and they are hilarious. But anyway, and I'm still here to tell the story. But this is the thing, when you're looking at mental health, think about the people you've got. You know, if you work in a company and your CEO and your C-suite are all over 50, you might want to get a defib on the top floor. You know, because you don't want to be running up the stairs to give them the kiss of life, do you? So this is where you've got to consider what it is. And this is the thing, we all need paperwork. We've got to have paperwork, but it's got to be the right paperwork. And one of the things I do as a consultant is I go into companies, I literally rip paperwork up. And I go, it's not adding value, it's wasting people's time and it's not driving the agenda. Let's have the right paperwork that's easy for people to use and do that. So, last little bit there. You might ask, I bet everyone's had a question mark at the end of their slides. And why do you think I've got a semicolon? Why do you think I'm not using a question mark there? This is a test for those that basically are the official grammar checker in the office. So a semicolon means it's not the end of a sentence, it's a break. And then you continue the sentence. That's how you use a semicolon in the English language. So this presentation isn't the end. This is the beginning of your ESG journey, and we're just taking a break now. So, if you've got any questions, please fire away. I might not know the answers, but I hope I've been entertaining, and I hope you've had a good day so far. Thank you very much.
I think there's been a few audience questions.
Oh no, they've gone, who is that man? How did he get there, and why did you let him out? Can I grab a bargee while you're working out the questions?
Sure, yeah.
I've been eyeing that up. Sorry? I've risked. I'm taking the risk.
The first question, Keith, is can you explain more about the Bank of England valuation of carbon?
Right. So one of the things the Bank of England. I took a bite and then you asked a question. So internal carbon pricing considers the cost of carbon in the supply chain. So, for instance, at the moment, carbon to offset it and things like that, if you were to buy bonds, I think JP Morgan have just bought the biggest bond ever for carbon offsetting. So if you're offsetting carbon, there is going to be a price. Now, if your carbon offset price is, and I'm just pulling this number out there, at the moment is £10 a tonne, and the Bank of England have predicted, he's Googling carbon pricing, isn't he? He's checking my numbers. The Bank of England say in 5 years' time it could be £100 a tonne. That needs to go on your risk register for your ESG, because you need to consider the impact that will have on your supply chain in your business. So in your business, you need to, now you can do it two ways. You can have official carbon pricing where you track it, or you can have virtual carbon pricing. So if you have official carbon pricing in a big company and someone says, I'm going to get a plane to that conference, there may be a levy on the cost of that plane for that department to encourage them to use a more carbon efficient method of journey. So some years ago, I had a company where lots of people were going from one office to another for meetings, and they said, if you car share, because it's going to save us money, because you're not giving us two lots of expenses, we're going to give one person extra 5p a mile. So in that way, they've kind of said, look, if you're going to both drive to the same meeting and then both drive back to the same office, why don't you car share? And here is the incentive to do that. So that's the challenge with carbon pricing. If carbon goes up in price, in terms of its holistic view within the cost of things, everything's going price. Your price of groceries is going to go up, and it's going to drive everything because carbon is produced in nearly every activity we do.
The question was about the Bank of England bit, which I think you may have mentioned earlier on.
So the Bank of England.
Where does that come into that picture?
Sorry, in terms of the risks.
Are they setting benchmarks?
Oh no, they are they're predicting. So in the same way they say inflation's going to go up, and or inflation, or this is how much the pound's going to be against that, and they forecast. This is where they're forecasting. The Bank of England believe within the next 10 years it's going to go up to £100 a tonne. So that's their forecast, and that's why when you're looking at your TOTEX costs within a business, you need to consider if you're doing something now, what's it going to cost you in 5-10 years time if you've got a 10-year project, 5-year project.
The other questions then we've got, does ESG cost money, or is it not more of an upfront investment rather than a cost?
So this is where you've got to look at both your CapEx cost and your OpEx cost. So when you're at home, do you have a pot of CapEx and OpEx money at home? Or do you go, actually, I can afford a takeaway, so that's probably OpEx, Or do you go, I need a new sofa? You don't have two pots of money called CapEx and OpEx at home. And this is where people have got to look at it, that in a business you have CapEx, I'm buying a new van, I'm buying computers, I'm buying tables and chairs, against OpEx, which is I've got to pay for the cleaning, I've got to pay for the heating, I've got to pay for that. Now, if you're changing your fleet of vehicles, that could be a CapEx, unless you lease them and then it goes to OpEx. But let's say we're buying vehicles, that's a CapEx investment. And your operational cost is going to be putting fuel and maintaining them. So ESG could cost you more up front because you've got to replace your fleet, but it might save you. So let's not think about the upfront. Any objective you deliver will cost you money, but can you leverage that objective to you become more efficient as a business as a whole? And it's not just about the price of products and goods. It's about how you go to meetings. It's about how you structure your day. It's about whether staff need travel. So it is a very big thing, but it is looking at those two things and going from a whole life cost, which is where carbon comes from, isn't it? From that whole life cost, how am I actually what is going to be the most efficient thing for my business to do in the long run, 5-10 years? Everything costs money.
The last question here is, how can I, as a developer, buy sustainably when being a buyer, like me, might be quite detached from the board itself?
So if you're a developer, so this is the thing, and you're never going to find that golden bullet. You're never going to find that solution. But we need to start having those conversations. So if you're a developer and you're developing thing, there is the opportunity to look at in terms of your procurement chain. Now, we can't fix it, and this is the big thing. I've got a friend of mine drives a 15-year-old car. They're not likely to be able to change that. As a developer, you are very driven by the client. Now, the great thing is that we've got investment banks at the moment. This is a big thing, especially from reputational risk, because they are the people to drive it. I really appreciate his comment because it's really hard to do stuff from the bottom up with ESG. You can want and you can look, and the best thing I would say is do his impacts and opportunities. I'm saying he, it could be she or they, but it could look at your impacts and opportunities. What impact can he have? And if he says that's the only impact I can have, the only thing I can do is use, a better paper or recyclable paper or that's the thing he can do. I'm a consultant. The only thing I can do is look at the vehicle I drive. That's the only impact I can really have. I can't impact to where my clients want me to go. I can suggest. Unfortunately, being an ESG consultant, I've got some strong arguments, but it is the case of looking and making sure, focus on his impacts, and don't sweat it if he doesn't feel he's having, because that small change that he implements is something that would drive him. So look at what he can do that is benefit to him, and let other people, worry about the big stuff. Because you can't change the board. It's like turning a super tanker. You can't do it. It's a very, very long journey. But if he looks at the small impacts and just worries about them, the small changes will support everyone.
I guess adding from my experience in that sort of arena as well, is that actually just making sure that what you're buying is sustainable,
Yeah.
Beyond just the label.
Yes, no greenwashing.
Understanding what the background is.
So it's things like pallets and, a company looks at if you've got a lot of wood products. Unfortunately, people, and I think this is quite funny with I'm going to be very political now, the Just Stop Oil people going, I want to Just Stop Oil. And you go, do you really realise just how much is involved in Just Stop Oil? Sustainable companies with sustainable practices now and in the future.
Question for me.
Yeah, no, I think it would be rude not to.
Social value.
Yeah.
How can you demonstrate that in a meaningful way and actually measure that in a meaningful way?
So, social value, this is a great one. Say you were going to do a develop in a new area. Well, one of the ways you can confuse that is actually say we're going to recruit in that area, we're going to train people up, we're going to give them skills. It kind of almost comes back to the old saying, well, what happens if we've got to spend money on training? And they go, well, what happens if we train them and they leave? Well, what happens if we don't train them and they stay? This is the issue you've got to look at, is ultimately in social values. It's not about sponsoring kiddie football teams. It's about providing a area you're working in with jobs, employment. It's being employer choice. It's people going, I like working for that company, having that low churn rate. So social values don't think about as, I've got to go and sponsor a kids football team, or I've got to open or sponsor this or sponsor that. It's not. That sponsorship money is better spent upskilling people within your business that can then go out. They might leave you, but they might go on to start their own business. They might go on to support you, become part of your supply chain. So it's growing that social wealth in an area you operate in. A really good example, I've been mindful because this has been recorded. There was a utility company that had to go and replace pipes in a very, very rundown area of Chatham. And it had to go and replace these pipes. And they actually took time to do recruitment drives in the streets of people, put a van up with a sign saying, do you want to work for us? And they recruited a lot of people that have been out of work for years and years and years. And by giving them a trade and supporting them, they increased people's worth. They had more money to spend. They could go to the shops, therefore shops growth. So this is social value. It is about spending money to make money. I know Rishi had it wrong with Eat Out, Dine Out, because then everyone got COVID again. But it's about creating that circle of wealth. But not only that, a side effect was all the lead and copper that was being taken out of the ground wasn't stolen as much because the supervisors lived in that local area, and when the local scally came along and went to lift the copper, he was like, oi, I know your mum. So things like that, and that's increased. So you've also increased the social area. It is the power of someone knowing your mum is a very powerful thing. But you know what I mean? So don't think about sponsoring football teams, things like that. It's creating I'm going to refer to it as etheric wealth. So you have actually got three methods of communication. You've got your physical communication, which is, me dancing around the stage, verbal communication, which you've all seen right now. But etheric communication is things like having lovely offices, having clean toilets, having a coat hook for people to put coats on. So people might get exactly the same pay from exactly the same job, in exactly the same place. But one company, they can hang their coat up, and the other company, they can't. Which one are you going to go and work for? And yet companies don't think like that. You know, it really is, comes down to social value is about just making people want to get up in the morning and go, I like being here. This is a nice place. There's something they've said about being rich, okay? Everyone goes, I want to be richer, I want to bet. You know, I'm going to ask them, cook it a low nose. Did you have a good night's sleep last night? So could you be any more wealthy in your quality of sleep? You can't. So when you look at your life and you say, am I rich? You had a great night's sleep last night. You are rich in that. Doesn't matter how much money you've got. You were not going to sleep better last night than you did the night before. And that's where people need to reassess what value and money and worth is to them. I had a terrible night's sleep, but that's because I was stressing over this. But anyway, have you got any more questions?
Yeah, I think a little thing that I would just like to say is, I think from the way you're describing it, I think the social, from the question that you asked, is literally making an impact. Really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I know it sounds weird. So I've got, in my bag, and you can all have it, I've got some nice pens. I don't work for many clients, so when I give them something like a gift, I make sure it's a nice pen. I spend a little bit more on it. Why? Because they'll be sitting there writing in the office, and they go, oh, it's a really nice, and someone goes, oh, that's a nice pen. Where'd you get it? And I go, oh, it's Keith. And suddenly they've got that thought of quality and delivery about me, you know? And I'm being talked about in a positive conversation. But if that pen broke, can you imagine? Then they go, who'd you get it? Oh, Keith. Oh, look, his pen broke. Terrible. And subconsciously, I'm in a negative thought zone in their head. So it is that kind of thing, especially impact, that social value. And that's huge. Reputational risk. Are you doing the right thing? If you're working in an area, do you proactively go and tell people you're going to work there, or do you wait for all the phone calls? So have outbound communication rather than inbound. And then when it is inbound and you fix it quickly, oh, yeah, they blocked my drive, but I rang it and someone came out straight, moved it, swept that. All about that positive interaction. And it's a bit, I think, we've lost in construction, things like that, about customer service. It's still very big. But if you had a complaint at a restaurant and they fixed it, you'd be more likely to go back, wouldn't you? And you'd be more likely to tell your friends and go, that restaurant's amazing. I had a problem and they fixed it. Whereas if everything went fine, you might not tell them you went there. If it went bad, you'll probably tell loads of people. So it's not about just doing service, it's giving that good feedback and that good interaction and that positive return. So I kind of get very enthused about behavioural management as well, by the way. That comes from my pub trade days. There's only one way you're going to get Big Dave to behave, and that's through positive reinforcement. So, you know Big Dave, do you? No, because you give Big Dave loads of beer, he's even worse. He's just, no, you just got to say, Dave, you're a lovely man. Please, sit down, behave yourself. Or I'm going to set the bar staff on you. But yeah, so that's right. So I hope I've entertained you. Because ultimately, ESG is really boring. And if we can make it fun, if you're laughing, you're learning. And that's really all we want to do today. So thank you. That's right.